When we look at the pantheon of Silicon Valley giants, Steve Jobs stands as a confusing anomaly. Bill Gates was a brilliant programmer. Mark Zuckerberg built the code for Facebook. Elon Musk understands rocket physics. But Steve Jobs, he didn't write code, he wasn't an engineer, he didn't have an MBA. When asked what he actually did, his co-founder Steve Wozniak, the man who actually built the computers, once famously asked, "You can't write code, you're not an engineer, you're not a designer, you can't put a hammer to a nail. I built the circuit board. Why do I read about you in the magazines?" It is a valid question. What was the specific utility of Steve Jobs? The answer is that Jobs possessed a psychological ability so potent that it compensated for every technical skill he lacked. His employees at Apple coined a term for it, borrowed from Star Trek, the reality distortion field. This was not just a fancy phrase for charisma. It was a description of a terrifying and mesmerizing phenomenon where Jobs could stand in front of a room of brilliant people, look them in the eye, and convince them that the laws of physics, the constraints of time, and the limits of technology did not apply. He didn't just ask for the impossible, he demanded it with such absolute conviction that the people around him began to question their own sanity. He realized early on that reality is not a fixed wall, it is a negotiation. And he refused to lose the negotiation. To understand how the reality distortion field works, we have to look at the development of the Macintosh in the early 1980s. One day, Jobs walked into the office of Larry Kenyon, the engineer responsible for the Mac's operating system. Jobs complained that the computer took too long to boot up. Kenyon, a brilliant engineer, explained the technical limitations. He laid out the math, the drive speeds, the code density, proving that it was physically impossible to make it faster. Jobs didn't argue the math. He changed the stakes. He asked, "If it would save a person's life, could you find a way to shave 10 seconds off the boot time?" Kenyon hesitated and said, "Well, maybe." Jobs then walked to a whiteboard and did a calculation. He said, "If 5 million people use the Mac, and it takes 10 seconds extra to turn it on every day, that's 300 million hours a year. That is at least 100 lifetimes saved." In that moment, the task changed from optimizing code to saving lives. Kenyon went back to work. A few weeks later, he had shaved 28 seconds off the boot time. The impossible became possible because Jobs refused to accept the premise of the limitation. This is the core mechanic of the field. Reframing. Most people look at a problem and ask, what do the resources allow? Jobs looked at the vision and asked, what does the outcome demand? He worked backward from the perfect future, ignoring the messy reality of the present until the present was forced to catch up. However, there is a dark psychology behind this level of standard setting. Jobs operated on a binary classification system. In his mind, everything in the world, people, products, ideas, food, fell into one of two categories, insanely great or total shit. There was no middle ground, there was no okay, no pretty good, no adequate. This binary worldview is incredibly stressful for those living in it, but it is incredibly effective for creating excellence. If you are an employee and you present work that is merely good, Jobs would tell you it was garbage. He would humiliate you. He would stare at you without blinking and tell you that you were ruining the company. This fear of being placed in the shit category drove people to work 90-hour weeks, to sleep under their desks, and to push their own talents further than they ever thought possible. They hated him for it, but they also did the best work of their lives for him. This is the Motivationairy paradox of high standards. We are taught that positive reinforcement is the best motivator. But Jobs proved that existential dread, the fear of being mediocre, is often a stronger fuel. He didn't care about your feelings, he cared about the product. He believed that being nice to an employee who was underperforming was a betrayal of the A players who were doing the work. He protected the quality of the team by ruthlessly culling the herd. The reality distortion field was not something Jobs could turn off. It bled into his personal life, often with tragic consequences. The most famous example is his denial of his daughter, Lisa. When she was born, Jobs simply decided that he wasn't the father. Even when a paternity test proved with 94.4% certainty that he was her father, he argued that 28% of the male population of the United States could be the father. He wasn't lying in the traditional sense. He had simply distorted reality so effectively that he believed his own fabrication. This is the danger of the visionary mind. When you spend your entire life proving that the facts are wrong and your intuition is right, you lose the ability to accept facts that you don't like. Later in life, when he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, the field turned on him. His doctors told him he needed surgery immediately. Jobs, believing he could control his body just as he controlled his company, refused. He tried to cure cancer with fruit diets and acupuncture. He believed his will was stronger than biology. By the time he accepted the reality of his condition and agreed to surgery, it was too late. The cancer had spread. The same psychological mechanism that gave us the iPhone, the refusal to accept limits, was the same mechanism that shortened his life. It is a sobering reminder that while you can bend reality, you cannot break it forever. So, what do we take from the life of Steve Jobs? Do we have to become narcissists to achieve greatness? No. But we must learn to immunize ourselves against the word impossible. The world is filled with people who will tell you why your idea won't work. They will have data, they will have experience, and they will have logic. And usually they are right. But the people who change the world are the ones who are crazy enough to think they are wrong. The reality distortion field, stripped of its toxicity, is simply the power of belief. It is the understanding that the world around you was built by people no smarter than you. It is the audacity to define your own timeline. You don't need to be cruel to be a visionary, but you do need to be stubborn. You need to hold the vision so clearly in your mind that the obstacles in front of you become translucent. Steve Jobs taught us that the best way to predict the future is to invent it, and the best way to invent it is to refuse to accept the present.